The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Peter Reed sat on the edge of the couch, his phone charger dangling forgotten from his fingers, while Ethan Gomez remained frozen in the doorway. The air felt electric with unspoken words, thick with the weight of everything they had been dancing around for months. Ethan's eyes held something Peter had never seen before, a vulnerability that made his chest tighten with hope and terror in equal measure. The casual excuse about returning the charger had dissolved the moment Ethan stepped inside, replaced by something far more profound and frightening. Peter whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet apartment. Ethan closed the door behind him with deliberate care, never breaking eye contact. What throughout? The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Peter felt his world tilt on its axis. After 2 years and 4 months of loving his best friend in secret, of listening to stories about failed relationships and offering comfort while his own heart slowly broke, this moment felt both inevitable and impossible. But to understand how they arrived at this precipice, how a simple charger return became the catalyst for everything to change, the story must begin 3 months earlier, when Peter first realized that his feelings for Ethan had crossed a line from which there was no return. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. It had started with coffee, as most important things in Peter's life seemed to. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of their shared apartment, casting golden streaks across Ethan's face as he stood at the counter, stirring sugar into his mug with the kind of absent concentration that Peter had learned to treasure. Peter watched from the doorway, cataloging this moment like he did all the others. The way Ethan's dark hair caught the light, the soft hum he made when he was content, the unconscious grace of his movements, even in something as simple as making coffee. Quote, Ethan said without turning around, but there was warmth in his voice, the kind of gentle teasing that had become their language over the past year of living together. Peter felt heat rise in his cheeks. Quote, 3. Ethan laughed, the sound bright and unguarded in the morning quiet. Quote, such a small gesture, such a simple kindness, but it was these moments that had been accumulating like storm clouds in Peter's chest, each one adding weight to feelings he couldn't name and couldn't escape. He accepted the mug Ethan offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The contact was brief, accidental, but Peter felt it like electricity shooting up his arm. If Ethan noticed his sharp intake of breath, he didn't comment. Ethan said, leaning against the counter with his own mug cradled in both hands. Peter's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression neutral. Marcus was Ethan's boyfriend of 6 months, a successful lawyer with perfect teeth in a perfect apartment and absolutely nothing interesting to say about anything. Peter had perfected the art of listening to Ethan talk about Marcus while feeling like a knife was slowly turning in his chest. Peter managed, taking a sip of coffee to buy himself time to arrange his features into something resembling enthusiasm. Quote 8. Ethan's voice carried a note Peter couldn't quite identify. Quote 9. The repetition of the word nice hung between them, and Peter caught something in Ethan's expression, a flicker of dissatisfaction that was there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But, Peter prompted gently. Ethan shrugged, but it wasn't casual. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of conversations he wasn't ready to have. No, but, just, sometimes I wonder if nice is enough. Peter's heart stuttered. Good day, 13. Ethan set his mug down and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Peter recognized as frustration. Quote for him, but Peter couldn't forget. The words echoed in his mind long after Ethan left for work, long after the apartment fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city waking up. Sometimes I wonder if nice is enough. The evening brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that turned the city into a watercolor painting viewed through their apartment windows. Peter had settled on the couch with a book, but the words blurred together as his mind wandered to Ethan's dinner with Marcus. He checked his phone for the third time in 10 minutes, though he had no reason to expect the message. When the key turned in the lock at 9:30, Peter looked up in surprise. Ethan stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. Quote 15. Peter observed, setting his book aside. Quote, Ethan hung his jacket on the hook by the door, movements careful and deliberate and, quote, There was something in his voice, a flatness, that made Peter sit up straighter. Quote one. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, standing in the entryway like he was deciding whether to stay or flee. Finally, he moved to the living room, but instead of taking his usual spot on the opposite end of the couch, he sat in the middle closer to Peter than usual. Quote 19. Ethan's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Always. Do you ever feel like you're playing a role, like you're acting the way you think you're supposed to act, but it doesn't feel real? Peter's breath caught. The question was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that for a moment he forgot how to respond. Chapter 22. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. Quote 23. Peter's heart was racing, but he kept his voice steady. That doesn't sound like nothing. Marcus is a good guy, Ethan continued, as if he hadn't heard. Wita Betty. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Peter wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he didn't trust himself to touch Ethan right now. Not when his friend was this vulnerable, this open. What do you think is missing? Peter asked carefully. Ethan looked up then, and Peter was struck by the confusion in his dark eyes. I don't know. That's the problem. I keep waiting to feel more. The way people talk about love, like it's this overwhelming, all-consuming thing. But with Marcus, it's just comfortable, safe. And maybe that's enough for most people, but not for you. But not for me. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Quote 31. Peter shook his head. Quote 30. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a flicker of recognition that made Peter's pulse quicken. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain pattering against the windows, the space between them charged with possibility. Ethan said finally, and there was something different in the way he said the name, like he was tasting it. The question was a minefield, and Peter knew he had to navigate it carefully. Quote 37, he said slowly. Quote 38. Ethan was staring at him now, really looking, and Peter felt exposed under that gaze. Ethan murmured. The question hit Peter like a physical blow. He could lie, deflect, change the subject. But Ethan was being so honest, so open, and the least Peter could do was offer some truth in return. Quote 40, he said quietly. Quote 5, quote victim. Peter's mouth went dry. This was dangerous territory, but Ethan was looking at him with such genuine curiosity, such trust, that he couldn't bring himself to lie completely. Quote 44, Peter said finally. Quote 40, an understanding flickered across Ethan's face, followed by something that might have been sympathy. That must be hard, loving someone in secret. It is. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. But sometimes loving someone means wanting their happiness more than your own. Ethan reached out then, his fingers finding Peter's hand where it rested on the couch between them. The contact was gentle, comforting, but it sent electricity racing through Peter's entire body. I'm sorry, Ethan said softly. That sounds lonely. Peter looked down at their joined hands, memorizing the sight. Sometimes, but it's also, I don't know, there's something beautiful about loving someone purely, without expectation. Do you think they might feel the same way? The question was so quiet, Peter almost missed it. When he looked up, Ethan was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. I don't know, Peter whispered. I hope so, but I'm terrified to find out. They sat like that for a long moment, hands linked, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, that Ethan squeezed Peter's fingers gently and pulled away. He said, but he made no move to get up. Ethan was quiet for so long that Peter thought he might not answer. Quote found, he said eventually. Quote fired, Peter nodded, trying to ignore the way his heart was breaking and mending itself simultaneously. Quote Stan, quote Fawn, Ethan stood up slowly, like he was reluctant to leave. Quote Fawn, if only that were true, Peter thought, as he watched Ethan disappear into his bedroom. If he knew what to say, he would tell Ethan that the love he was describing, the connection he was searching for, was sitting right here on this couch. He would tell him that the reason Marcus felt like a comfortable lie was because Ethan was meant for something truer, something deeper. But instead, Peter picked up his forgotten book and tried to pretend that his world hadn't just shifted on its axis. The next few weeks passed in a strange sort of limbo. Ethan continued to see Marcus, but something had changed between them. Peter could see it in the way Ethan talked about their dates, the careful neutrality in his voice when Marcus's name came up. There was a distance there that hadn't existed before, like Ethan was pulling back without quite realizing it. Meanwhile, the dynamic between Peter and Ethan had shifted in subtle but significant ways. They found themselves lingering in conversations, sitting closer together and on the couch during movie nights, sharing looks across rooms that lasted a beat too long. It was as if their conversation that rainy evening had opened a door that neither of them could quite close. Peter caught himself watching Ethan more often, memorizing the way he laughed at stupid jokes, the concentrated expression he wore while cooking, the soft smile that appeared when he was reading something that pleased him. Each observation felt like a small theft, moments stolen from a life he wasn't supposed to want. It was on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the dinner conversation, that everything began to unravel in earnest. Peter was in his room attempting to grade papers when he heard the apartment door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. He found Ethan in the kitchen, pacing like a caged animal, his phone clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "What shall?" Peter asked, though he could guess. Quotes iron Ethan's voice was tight with frustration. "We had another one of those conversations about our future, and when I tried to tell him I needed more time to figure things out, he accused me of leading him on." Peter felt a familiar twist of anger at the thought of someone making Ethan feel guilty for his uncertainty. "That's not fair, isn't it, though?" Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face Peter, his eyes bright with the unshed tears. "I have been leading him on, haven't I? Staying in a relationship when I know it's not right, when I know I'm not giving him what he deserves. Ethan, he asked me if there was someone else." The words came out in a rush, like Ethan couldn't hold them back any longer. Put. The admission hit Peter like a physical blow. For a moment, the kitchen went completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Quote 72. Peter's voice came out as barely a whisper. Ethan's face crumpled. 70, quote 7. Peter took a step forward, his mind reeling. Quote 7. Quote is Ethan was backing toward the door, panic clear in his expression. Quote 77. But Peter couldn't let him leave. Not now. "You said you might be in love with your best friend." Ethan stopped moving, his back pressed against the kitchen doorframe. "Peter, please, I can't do this right now." "Do what?" "Ruin everything." Ethan's voice broke on the words. Quote 82. Peter felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. Quote was quote hammered. Ethan was shaking now, and Peter could see him fighting tears. Quote Bob. The words hung between them like a bridge, and Peter knew that whatever he said next would determine whether they crossed it or burned it down. Code 86, Peter said softly. Quote 87. Ethan looked up at him then, really looked, and Peter saw hope and terror warring in his dark eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. Peter watched as understanding dawned across Ethan's face, followed quickly by shock, then something that might have been relief. "Peter," Ethan whispered, "are you telling me that you—" "I'm telling you that I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months," Peter said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm telling you that every time you talked about Marcus, I wanted to scream because I knew he couldn't love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm telling you that when you asked me about loving someone in secret, you were sitting right next to the answer." Ethan's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with shock. Quote, quote iron. The words came out in a rush, like Ethan couldn't hold them back any longer. "I do feel the same way. That's what's been driving me crazy. All this time, I thought something was wrong with me because I couldn't fall in love with Marcus. But it was because I was already in love with you." Peter felt his knees go weak. "What?" "I love you, Peter. I think I have for a long time, but I was too scared to admit it. Even to myself, when Marcus talks about our future, all I can think about is how wrong it feels because you're not in it, not the way I want you to be." The distance between them seemed to collapse all at once. Peter crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and then Ethan was in his arms, and they were both crying and laughing and holding each other like they were afraid one of them might disappear. I can't believe this is real, Ethan murmured against Peter's shoulder. Code 100. Peter pulled back just enough to cup Ethan's face in his hands, thumbs brushing away the tears on his cheeks. I've never felt anything more real in my life. They stood like that for a moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air, and Peter felt like his heart might burst from the sheer rightness of it all. Peter, Ethan whispered, can I kiss you? The question was so soft, so tentative, but it carried the weight of everything they had been building toward. Peter nodded, not trusting his voice, and then Ethan's lips were on his, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as Peter responded. The kiss was everything Peter had imagined, and nothing like he had expected. It was neat and desperate and perfect, tasting of coffee and tears and the promise of something beautiful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against Peter's again. Wow, Ethan breathed. Yeah, Peter agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Wow. They spent the rest of the evening on the couch, talking in the way that only people who have just discovered they love each other can talk. Everything felt new and urgent and precious, like they were trying to make up for lost time. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, Ethan said, his head pillowed on Peter's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. Quote 109. Peter pressed a kiss to the top of Ethan's head, still hardly believing this was real. You weren't blind. You were figuring things out. We both were. When did you know? Ethan asked. When did you realize you were in love with me? Peter thought about it, tracing patterns on Ethan's arm with his free hand. Quote one far, Ethan lifted his head to look at Peter. Quote one fit, Ethan's eyes were soft with emotion. I remember thinking that no one had ever taken care of me like that before. Not even people who claimed to love me. What about you? Peter asked. When did you know? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on Peter's palm. Quote 119. Peter felt his chest tighten with emotion. Quote Gwanin, quote Gwen. Ethan said quietly. Quote 122. Peter squeezed Ethan's hand. And how do you feel about that now? Ethan smiled, the expression soft and wondering. Terrified, exhilarated, like I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be. They talked until nearly 3 a.m, sharing fears and hopes in the 1,000 small moments that had led them to this point. When exhaustion finally began to claim them, Ethan hesitated at the hallway that led to their separate bedrooms. I don't want to be apart from you tonight, he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly. Is that okay? Peter's heart swelled. Quote 127. They ended up in Peter's room, lying fully clothed on top of the covers, facing each other in the dim light filtering through the curtains. It was innocent and intimate all at once, the simple pleasure of being close without pretense. What happens now? Ethan asked softly. With Marcus, with us, with everything. Peter reached out to brush a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. Quote 130. Ethan nodded. Quote saw, quote where, quote version. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Terrified, Peter admitted, but also happier than I've ever been. Ethan smiled, the expression radiant even in the dim light. Me too. They fell asleep like that, hands linked between them, and Peter's last coherent thought was that he had never felt more at peace. The next morning brought coffee and awkward smiles and the strange new reality of everything having changed overnight. Peter woke to find Ethan already up, standing by the window with a mug in his hands, looking out at the city with a thoughtful expression. Quote 137. Peter said softly, not wanting to startle him. Ethan turned, and his face lit up with a smile that made Peter's heart skip. Good morning, I made coffee. Thank you. Peter accepted the mug Ethan offered, and when their fingers brushed, neither of them pulled away. How are you feeling? Like I'm living in a dream, Ethan admitted. A really good dream that I'm afraid I'll wake up from. Peter set his coffee aside and reached for Ethan's free hand. Quote 153. Ethan squeezed his fingers. Quote 144 mm. Quote 145 mm. Quote 146. Peter nodded without hesitation. Quote 147. The conversation with Marcus was as difficult as they had anticipated. Ethan was honest but kind, explaining that he had realized he wasn't in love and that it wasn't fair to continue the relationship. Marcus was hurt and angry, which was understandable, but he was also decent enough to wish Ethan well before hanging up. Ethan collapsed onto the couch afterward, emotionally drained. Quote 148. Peter sat beside him, offering comfort without crowding. Quote Wardiner, quote Wufty. Ethan agreed. Quote 151. The word us sent a thrill through Peter that he was still getting used to. After so long of thinking of Ethan as an impossible dream, the reality of being together felt almost surreal. They spent the day in their apartment, talking and kissing and learning the new language of being together. Everything felt heightened, significant. The way Ethan looked at him over lunch, the casual way he reached for Peter's hand while they watched a movie, the soft kiss he pressed to Peter's temple when he thought Peter wasn't paying attention. I keep thinking about all the time we wasted, Ethan said that evening as they prepared dinner together. All those months of being miserable when we could have been happy. Peter paused in chopping vegetables. Do you really think it was wasted time? Ethan considered this, leaning against the counter. What do you mean? I mean, maybe we needed that time. Maybe we both needed to figure out who we were and what we wanted before we could be ready for this. You think so? Peter nodded. I think if we had gotten together earlier, we might not have been ready for how big this is, how important. Maybe we needed to be sure. Ethan moved closer, slipping his arms around Peter's waist from behind. Core 159. Peter leaned back against Ethan's chest, marveling at how natural it felt. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That night, they fell asleep in Peter's bed again, this time with the easy intimacy of people who belong together. Peter woke once in the early hours of the morning to find Ethan watching him with a soft smile. Quote, "Sides, but he didn't remember." Quote, "Watching," Ethan replied. Quote, "Wanted." Peter reached up to cup Ethan's face, thumb brushing across his cheekbone. I'm not going anywhere. What's your mission? Promise? I promise. Ethan leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering closed. I love you, Peter. I love you too. They were simple words, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through to get here. Peter fell back asleep with those words echoing in his mind, and when he woke in the morning, Ethan was still there. 3 weeks later, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Their apartment had transformed from a shared space between friends into a home for two people building a life together. Ethan's clothes had migrated into Peter's closet. They cooked dinner together every night. They had claimed the opposite ends of the couch as their official spots, but somehow always ended up tangled together in the middle by the end of each movie. The outside world had been informed gradually. Their close friends had reacted with varying degrees of surprise and support, though several admitted they had suspected something for months. Ethan's family had been more challenging, requiring several difficult phone conversations, but they were coming around. Peter's parents had simply asked when they could meet Ethan properly, as if they had been expecting this development all along. I think your mom likes me better than she likes you, Ethan teased after their first family dinner together. She kept showing me baby pictures and telling me embarrassing stories about your childhood. She's been waiting for someone to appreciate them properly, Peter replied, pulling Ethan closer on the couch. She's also been waiting for me to bring home someone who makes me this happy. Do I make you happy? Ethan asked, though his tone was playful rather than insecure. Peter pressed a kiss to his temple, deliriously so. They had also navigated the practical aspects of their new relationship. The conversation about exclusivity had been brief and unanimous. The discussion about the future had been longer and more complex, but ultimately reassuring. They both wanted the same things: a partnership built on friendship and respect, a home filled with laughter and books and good food, the simple pleasure of growing old together. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Ethan admitted one evening as they lay in bed, his head on Peter's chest. Peter ran his fingers through Ethan's hair. What would convince you that this is real? That it's going to last? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Time, I guess. The knowledge that we can weather whatever comes next. We will, Peter said with quiet certainty. We've already weathered the hardest part. What was the hardest part? Not knowing if you felt the same way. Everything else is just logistics. Ethan lifted his head to look at Peter. You really believe that? I really do. Ethan smiled, the expression soft and trusting. then I believe it too. 6 months after that first confession in the kitchen, Peter found himself once again sitting on their couch, waiting for Ethan to come home. But this time, the anticipation was sweet rather than painful. This time, he knew that when Ethan walked through the door, he would light up at the sight of Peter. This time, there were no secrets between them. The key turned in the lock at exactly 6:30, and Ethan appeared in the doorway with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a smile that still made Peter's heart skip. Quote 186, Ethan said, dropping his bag and crossing to the couch. Quote 187, quote 1, Peter replied, pulling Ethan down for a kiss. It was a greeting that had become as natural as breathing, but it still sent warmth spreading through his chest. Ethan settled beside him, close enough that their thighs touched. Quote 189 and quote 190 and quote 1911. Ethan's eyes were bright with excitement. Remember that promotion I applied for last month? Peter sat up straighter. You got it? I got it. Ethan's grin was radiant at about 5. Peter launched himself across the small space between them, wrapping Ethan in a fierce hug. Quote 196. Quote 197. Ethan held him tight, and Peter could feel the happiness radiating from him. Down, Peter pulled back to look at him. Ottoman, quote to 200, Ethan said softly. Showing time. They celebrated with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine that had been sitting in their kitchen for months, waiting for a special occasion. They talked about Ethan's new responsibilities, about the changes it would bring, about the future they were building together. I've been thinking, Ethan said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes, about what you said that night about loving someone purely, without expectation. Peter paused in loading the dishwasher. What about it? I think that's what made this work. The fact that you loved me without needing anything in return. It gave me the space to figure out my own feelings without pressure. Peter considered this. I think you're right. If I had pushed or tried to force something that wasn't ready to happen naturally, it would have ruined everything. And now? Now I get to love you with expectation, Peter said, smiling. The expectation that you'll love me back, that we'll build something beautiful together, that every day will be better than the last. Ethan set down the dish towel and moved closer. And are those expectations being met? Exceeded, Peter said without hesitation. Ethan cupped Peter's face in his hands, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. The kiss that followed was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Ethan rested his forehead against Peter's. I have something else to tell you, Ethan said quietly. What? I love you more every day. Sometimes it scares me how much. Peter's heart swelled. Quote 276, quote 217, quote 219. Ethan smiled, the expression radiant. Quote 2, they stood like that for a moment, holding each other in their kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary details of the life they had built together. The dishwasher hummed quietly in the background. The city lights twinkled through their windows. Everything was exactly as it should be. 1 year later, Peter found himself in the same position that had started everything, sitting on their couch, waiting for Ethan to come home. But this time, he was holding a small velvet box, his heart racing with anticipation rather than uncertainty. The ring inside had belonged to his grandmother, a simple but elegant band with a single diamond that caught the light like a promise. He had spent weeks planning this moment, considering and discarding elaborate schemes before deciding that the most important conversations of their relationship had happened right here. In this space they had made their own. When Ethan walked through the door, he immediately sensed that something was different. His eyes went to the box in Peter's hands, then to Peter's face, and understanding dawned slowly. What aren't you? Ethan breathed, setting down his bag with careful deliberation. Quote 221. Peter said, standing up on legs that felt unsteady. Quote talk. Ethan's eyes were bright with tears. Peter, I know it's soon by some people's standards, Peter continued, his voice gaining strength. But we've been building toward this from the moment we met. Every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet evening together has been part of this foundation. I don't need more time to know that you're my person, Ethan. You always have been. Peter dropped to one knee, and Ethan's hand flew to his mouth, a sob escaping despite his efforts to contain it. What to time? Peter said, opening the box to reveal the ring. 7. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Ethan was dropping to his knees as well, reaching for Peter with shaking hands. He said through his tears. Peter slipped the ring onto Ethan's finger with hands that trembled slightly, and then they were kissing and crying and holding each other like they never wanted to let go. I can't believe this is real, Ethan whispered against Peter's lips. What a 2-3-1. Quote Turau, Peter assured him. Quote Turian, quote Ethan said without hesitation. Quote 35. They stayed on the floor of their living room for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future they would build together, about the wedding they would plan, the home they would create, the family they might have someday, about growing old together and never taking for granted the miracle of finding each other. Do you remember what you said that first night? Ethan asked eventually. About real love feeling like coming home? Peter nodded. I remember. I finally understand what you meant. Us, it doesn't feel like falling in love. It feels like remembering how to be myself. Peter's chest tightened with emotion. Guatao 240. They ordered a pizza for dinner and called their families and friends, sharing their news with voices bright with joy. They talked until late into the night about their hopes and dreams and the life they were choosing to build together. When they finally went to bed, Ethan kept looking at the ring on his finger like he couldn't quite believe it was real. No second thoughts? Peter asked, settling beside him. None, Ethan said firmly. You? Not a single one. Ethan turned to face him, reaching out to trace the line of Peter's jaw. Quote 245. Peter caught Ethan's hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. I love you too, Ethan Gomez, my fiancé. The words felt like a promise, like a prayer, like the beginning of everything they had been building toward. Peter fell asleep that night with Ethan's hand in his, the ring a tangible reminder that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with friendship and grow into something extraordinary. The wedding took place 8 months later in the same park where they had taken their first official date as a couple. It was a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, but it felt like the most important event either of them had ever experienced. Peter stood at the makeshift altar, watching Ethan walk down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Ethan looked radiant in his navy suit, his smile bright enough to power the entire city. When he reached Peter's side, he whispered, "Hi, husband-to-be," and Peter felt his heart might burst from happiness. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. They had written their own vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life might bring. When the officiant pronounced them married, the kiss they shared felt like the culmination of everything they had worked toward. How does it feel to be married? Ethan asked during their first dance, his arms wrapped around Peter's neck. Quote 249. Peter replied, echoing the words that had become their truth. Quote 250. Quote 251, Ethan said without hesitation. Quote 252. They danced to the same song that had been playing the night of their first confession, and Peter marveled at how far they had come. From secret longing to mutual love, to this moment, married and surrounded by people who celebrated their happiness. Later, as they sat at their sweetheart table, watching their friends and family celebrate around them, Ethan reached for Peter's hand. Do you ever think about that night, he asked, the night everything changed? All the time, Peter admitted. Do you? I think about how scared I was, Ethan said. How certain I was that I would ruin everything by telling you how I felt. And now look at us. Peter squeezed his hand. Now look at us. I'm glad we were both brave enough to take the leap. I'm glad you came home early from dinner with Marcus. Ethan laughed. I'm glad you were patient enough to wait for me to figure myself out. I would have waited forever, Peter said softly. I know, Ethan replied. That's part of what made me brave enough to love you back. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their loved ones dance and laugh around them. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the park, and everything felt perfect. What are you thinking about? Peter asked. Just this, Ethan said, gesturing to encompass the scene around them. How lucky we are. How rare this is, what we have. Peter nodded. I used to think that loving you in secret was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. But this, loving you openly, building a life together, is even better. Much better, Ethan agreed. Though I'm grateful for all of it. The secret years, the confusion, the fear. It all led us here. It did, Peter said. And now we get to see what comes next. I can't wait, Ethan said, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to Peter's wedding ring. Tut 75. 2 years into their marriage, Peter and Ethan had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They had moved into a larger apartment with space for an office and a proper dining room where they could host the dinner parties that had become a regular part of their social life. Their friends often joked that their home was the place where everyone felt most comfortable, most themselves. Quote 76, their friend Sarah had explained one evening after a particularly successful dinner party. Quote 7, Peter had blushed at the compliment, but Ethan had simply smiled and pulled Peter closer on the couch. Chem 78, he had agreed. On this particular evening, they were alone again, cleaning up after hosting Ethan's parents for dinner. The visit had gone well, better than either of them had dared hope when Ethan first came out to his family. His mother had spent the evening showing Peter photo albums and sharing embarrassing stories about Ethan's childhood, while his father had engaged Peter in long conversations about books and current events. Quote 279, Ethan said as they loaded the dishwasher together. Quote 280, Peter replied. Quote 281. Quote 2, Ethan said, bumping Peter's shoulder affectionately. How settled and content. Do you feel settled and content? Ethan paused in his dish loading to consider the question. I feel like myself, he said finally. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person. Peter's chest tightened with emotion. Even after all this time, Ethan's words had the power to overwhelm him with love and gratitude. I feel the same way, Peter said softly. Like everything before this was just preparation for the real thing. They finished cleaning in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the practiced ease of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. When the kitchen was spotless, they settled on the couch with cups of tea, Ethan's head pillowed on Peter's shoulder. Ethan said after a few minutes of quiet. Peter set down his tea and shifted so he could see Ethan's face. What have you been thinking? I want kids, Ethan said simply. Not right now, but someday. I want to raise children with you, to give them the kind of home we've built together. Peter felt his heart skip. They had talked about children before, in abstract terms, but this felt more concrete, more real. I want that too, Peter said. I think about it sometimes, what our kids would be like. Whether they'd have your sense of humor or my stubborn streak. Both, probably, Ethan said with a laugh. Poor things. They'd be lucky to have you as a father, Peter said seriously. You're going to be amazing with kids. We're going to be amazing, Ethan corrected, together. They talked for hours about their hopes for the future, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about the values they wanted to instill in their children. It was the kind of conversation that felt both monumental and completely natural. Another step in the ongoing process of building a life together. Do you ever think about that alternate timeline? Ethan asked as they were getting ready for bed. The one where we never figured this out? Peter paused in brushing his teeth. What do you mean? I mean, what if I had stayed with Marcus? What if I had convinced myself that comfortable was enough? What if you had never told me how you felt? Peter rinsed his mouth and turned to face his husband. Do you think about that? Sometimes, Ethan admitted, and it terrifies me. The thought of living my whole life without this, without us. I would have been missing the most important part of myself and never even known it. Peter reached for Ethan's hands. Quote 311. Ethan agreed. Quote 312. They went to bed that night with plans and dreams filling their minds, their future stretching out before them bright with possibility. Peter fell asleep listening to Ethan's steady breathing, marveling at the simple miracle of being loved so completely. 5 years after their wedding, Peter stood in the doorway of their nursery, watching Ethan rock their 6-month-old daughter to sleep. The room was painted a soft yellow, filled with books and toys and the kind of love that Peter had only dreamed of when he was younger. Emma had come to them through adoption, a process that had been long and sometimes difficult, but ultimately perfect. The moment they had first held her, Peter had understood what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. She was their daughter in every way that mattered, and watching Ethan with her never failed to fill Peter's chest with overwhelming emotion. Quote 313, Peter whispered from the doorway. Ethan looked up with a soft smile. Quote 314, Peter crossed the room quietly and settled in the chair beside them. Emma was indeed drowsy but determined to stay awake, her dark eyes blinking slowly as she fought sleep. Ethan murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. Quote 316, Peter replied, reaching out to stroke her tiny hand. Quote 3 and quote Brown, Ethan agreed without shame. Quote, Peter laughed softly. Quote to one, and Emma finally surrendered to sleep, her tiny body relaxing in Ethan's arms. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both reluctant to break the spell of this quiet moment. Do you remember what you said on our wedding night? Ethan asked eventually. About how our story was just beginning? I remember. I think I finally understand what you meant. Everything before Emma felt like the prologue. This feels like the real story. Peter nodded, his throat tight with emotion. She's made us a family. We were already a family, Ethan corrected gently. She's made us complete. They put Emma in her crib together, both of them lingering to watch her sleep. In the soft glow of the nightlight, she looked like a perfect miracle, the embodiment of everything they had hoped for. Later, as they settled into bed, Ethan reached for Peter's hand in the darkness. He said quietly. Peter turned to face his husband, even though they could barely see each other in the dark. Oh, the 33. Quote down, Ethan said without hesitation. Quote 3. Peter leaned forward to press a soft kiss to Ethan's lips. Then we're both exactly where we need to be. We are, Ethan agreed. We really are. As they drifted off to sleep, Peter reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first confession in their kitchen to this quiet evening in their family home, every step had been worth it. Every moment of uncertainty, every leap of faith, every choice to be vulnerable had led them here. He thought about that younger version of himself, sitting on the couch and loving Ethan in secret, never imagining that this kind of happiness was possible. If he could go back and tell that Peter anything, it would be this. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard. And sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most extraordinary rewards. In the morning, they would wake to Emma's cheerful babbling over the baby monitor. They would make coffee and breakfast and plan their day around nap times and feeding schedules. They would be tired and happy and grateful for the ordinary miracle of their life together. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Peter Reed and Ethan Gomez fell asleep as they had every night for years, hand in hand, heart to heart, exactly where they belonged.